Today, as is obvious by now, is Palm Sunday. It is a good day, a high point in our liturgical year. There's a parade, joyous hosannas, and high hopes for what can be. It's a good day. I always have mixed feelings, though, preaching on Palm Sunday, because we all know that we do not have to scratch the surface much to see that there is more to this day than hosannas and a parade. Palm Sunday sometimes feels to me like a life of faith in microcosm. Hope and faith meet tragic reality this week. And this morning, we set off on that journey. What does Palm Sunday hold for us this year? The story of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem the week he will be put to death is a familiar one. All four of the Gospels writers tell of it. This event is clearly significant in the story of Jesus' life and ministry. There was a parade that day. It started small. Out of the east of town came an itinerant preacher, prophet some said, riding on a young donkey, or maybe it was a colt. It was a commoner's procession, but it still had its share of passion, for this one might be the one to bring the promised revolution. Some scholars believe that there was also another parade in town that day, coming out of the west side, the other side of town. In that parade, Pilate was riding into town with all the gaudy show of his imperial power, horses, chariots, and gleaming armor. It was his practice to move into Jerusalem with the power of the Roman army at the beginning of Passover a week each year, to remind people who had the power. Be sure, nothing got out of hand, because insurrection was always in the air this time of year, as the Hebrew people remembered and celebrated God's deliverance from another time of oppressive power, when the people were freed from the enslavement in Egypt. Authors John Dominic Crossan and Marcus Borg lift up this sharply contrasting picture of the beginning of Jesus' last week on earth in their book, The Last Week. The image is a powerful one. They argue that Jesus' careful preparations, given in fine detail in Luke's account that we read this morning, suggest that Jesus had planned this to be a highly ritualized and symbolic prophetic act in direct contrast to the political powers of the day. Presbyterian pastor Michael Linville agrees. He calls the Palm Sunday scene one eloquently deliberate parody on power. Jesus wanted the contrast to be obvious and the message to be clear. His coming kingdom, his power, would be different from business as usual. Was it Jesus, the gospel writer Luke, or maybe some combination of both, who brought this story of the East Side Parade together with the words of the prophet Zechariah, written maybe 500 years before, that read, and now I'm reading the Message version of Zechariah 9, "Shout and cheer, daughter Zion. Raise the roof, daughter Jerusalem. Your king is coming, a good king who makes all things right, a humble king riding a donkey, a mere colt of a donkey. I've had it with war. No more chariots in Ephraim. No more war horses in Jerusalem. No more swords and spears and bows and arrows. He will offer peace to the nations, a peaceful rule worldwide, from the four winds to the seven seas." Peaceful power, peaceful rule. As Luke tells the story, the whole multitude of followers, now this time an earthly multitude, replacing that heavenly multitude, Luke notes, that was present at Jesus' birth, began proclaiming the glory of this day, saying, "Blessed is the King who comes in the name of the Lord, peace in heaven and glory to the highest heaven." Hope abounds. Things are going to change. The time has come, finally, for the people. But for some, this new way was not a blessing, but a threat. Some of the Pharisees, the leaders of Jesus' faith community, interrupted the parade and said to Jesus, "Order your disciples to stop." Were they ashamed by the wild expression of praise? Were they afraid that the Romans over on the other side of town would smell insurrection and come with terrible vengeance against their nation? Was Jesus' power, Jesus' way, too much of a threat to the way things were? The contrast between the two parades was just too obvious. But the news is too good to be quieted. Jesus responds to the Pharisees, "I tell you, if these were silent, the stones would shout out." Luke is alone in recording these faith-filled words. Nothing will stop the proclamation of this truth. With this, I think of some of the parades and marches of our time that are expressions of peaceful power and truth in the face of oppressive, the way things are. The recent March for Our Lives is one example. You may have noticed that my sermon title for today, I imagined this week that if Luke were writing today, he would claim the hashtag Shouting Stones, and it would join other hashtags in lighting up Twitter in the name of justice and peaceful but powerful and transformative movements. This is, I think, the heart of what we celebrate at Palm Sunday. I tell you, if these were silent, the stones would cry out. This message will not be quieted. This parade will not be stopped. This new way of living in peace and communion will come. And we here on Palm Sunday in 2019 know, of course, the rest of the story of this last week of Jesus' earthly life. The clash between what has always been, the expected, the normal powers of the day, and the new way of being will be fatal for Jesus this week. As I mentioned earlier, this day, more than any other day in our year perhaps, brings vividly before us the fullness of the life of Christ. Today we pivot between the happy triumph and hope. I tell you, if these were silent, the stones would cry out. And the coming crucifixion only a few days away. We gather here today with that sharp mix of hosannas and tears between the already and the not yet. According to Luke, the festive mood we read in our passage for this morning does not last long. Jesus and his parade come around the bend and something changes. In the verses immediately following those that we read this morning, we read that as the city comes into view, Jesus stops and he weeps for Jerusalem. He says, "Jerusalem, if only today you knew the things that make for peace, but you do not know them. They are hidden from your eyes." And the warmth and the joy of this day is replaced with a chilling reminder of what is to come this week. How far we have yet to go. Another Presbyterian pastor and author, William Carter, puts it this way: Jesus rides no high horse, just a lowly colt. He chooses to enter a deadly situation without force or protection. He gives himself freely and without reservation. This is a prophetic act, a sign of God's vulnerable love, which risks everything and promises to gain all. This is the means by which God creates peace. This is the means by which God creates peace. Today reminds us of the certainty of God's reign. The very stones would cry out. This peace Christ brings will reign. This day also reminds us of just how far we have to go, how different that reign is from all that we expect and can even imagine. The contrast is sharp. We're not yet there yet, far from it. We continue to struggle personally, nationally, and globally with seeing things that make for peace and making them our ways. We know what lies ahead this week. We know about the West Side parades that march on in our hearts, in our country, in our world. We know how difficult it is for us to really live the peace that Jesus proclaims. Yet even on this day and through this week, we are Easter people. And we know that if we were silent, the very stones would shout out. That the power of self-giving love that Jesus proclaims and lives will reign, does reign. May we bear testimony to that love, that coming kingdom with our lives, this Holy Week and always. Amen.